Hello again, everybody. So due to overwhelming popular demand, I decided to take my assessment presentation from a couple weeks ago and turn it into a brief video. And by overwhelming popular demand, I mean that every single person I know failed to ask me to not do this. Now, we zoom in here a little bit. I want to note that I'm a little bit proud of how I embedded all the different elements of the presentation into the A for assessment, but not quite as proud as I would have been if I had thought of this myself. Credit for it actually goes to Sita Salas, so thank you, Sita, for making me look a little bit more creative than I actually am. So why are we here? Well, we're here to talk about selected suggestions for the effective evaluation of student learning, and our ultimate goal is to get our students to respond to our assessments, our exams, our discussion assignments, our papers, the same way that this guy right here is responding to whatever it is he's doing. If we can get to that point, we know we truly have succeeded. And I also should note that all of these suggested practices come from a robust literature. They come from replicated findings, they come from meta-analyses. I didn't try to put together the most comprehensive list of suggested practices, but it's a solid list. It's a good foundation. And the first of these suggestions is that assessment should be explicitly tied to learning outcomes. We want to make it clear how this particular assessment is linked to the overarching goals for the course. And this is really good for students because it helps reinforce the things that we think are most important for them to know. And we can do an even better job of this by using the Course Goals tool in Web Campus, which we talked about not too long ago. A second suggested practice is that assessment should be learner-centered, and we hear a lot about that. One way in which we can make our assessments more learner-centered is put less of a focus on factual knowledge and more of a focus on transferable knowledge and skills. And this isn't to say that factual knowledge isn't important. It's important, but it really isn't our main purview anymore. At least I think you could make that argument, right? It used to be 30, 40, 50 years ago that people would go to college because we were the only ones who had certain kinds of information. But now information is everywhere. It's increasingly abundant, and for all intents and purposes, it's free. So what do? How do we continue to provide value to students? Well, one of the things we can do in the wake of this development is help students discern good information from bad information, and help them know why some information is good and why other types of information are not as good. And I think one could argue that this is only becoming more and more important as time goes on, right? It's not the only kind of transferable skill, and that's up to you to decide, but it is a skill that, if anything, is going to become increasingly important, as this quote implies. Now, a third suggested practice is that assessment should promote the use of higher order cognitive processes. And you'll see that this is an old reference and an old finding, but that just means it's a time-tested finding. And the finding is that the deeper you process something, the better you are able to remember it, and the better you are able to apply it in the future. And so how can we promote the use of higher order cognitive processes? Well, one of the things we can do is we really can try to get students to think critically about the subject matter. It's not just a matter of regurgitating facts and bits of information and throwing them back at us. It's applying this information. It's reflecting on this information. I like the idea of metacognition. I think StudyMate's actually a good example where you get students to think about what do they know and what do they not know. When you have to come up with your own question, it actually requires you to understand the material pretty well. You have to know the answer, of course, to the question, but you also have to come up with alternative answers or alternative responses that are wrong but still plausible. And if you don't really know the material, you're not going to be able to do that. Another way we can do this is get students to apply what they have learned, especially apply it to novel situations. A good example of that, I believe, is an assignment in which students had to come up with an artificial virus that would cure cancer, right? That's a pretty compelling assignment, but it's also a really, really important one. And it actually brings us to our fourth suggestion. And our fourth suggestion is that assessment should illuminate questions people really care about, such as coming up with a cure for cancer, right? As much as we can, we want our students to be dealing with important issues that resonate with them. They're going to do better work, they're going to better apply what they have learned, and ultimately I think they're going to benefit more in the long run. A fifth suggestion is that assessment should incorporate a variety of methodologies, right? So we want to have closed-ended responses. We want to have open-ended responses. There's tons of literature on the value of open-ended responses. And more than anything, we want to use these different types of methodologies because it allows us to triangulate. Okay, and people hear about triangulating. Maybe you don't hear about it a lot, but you hear about triangulating when it comes to things like satellites, right? So 3 satellites working in concert could better pinpoint a specific location and more accurately pinpoint a specific location than any one satellite working on its own. And it really is very similar when it comes to methodologies. 3 different types of methodologies can better pinpoint what a student really knows and can do than any methodology on its own. And part of the reason for that is every methodology has its strengths and weaknesses. And what usually happens is the strengths of one methodology can compensate for the weaknesses of a different methodology and vice versa. Using them all together really will allow us to get the most complete sense of a student's mastery of the material. And a final suggestion is that assessment should gauge performance over time. This is good for us, right? It shows that when we're scaffolding knowledge and skills, that the foundation we're setting for students really is leading to higher levels of understanding, but also is good for students, right? Their progress is rewarding, and they should be able to see the progress in some sort of salient fashion. So we suggest that you take this into account when you're designing your assessments and charting the progression of students over time. And that's it. That's all I have. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time.